So, Sherman Varshmagar is the director of the Research Institute for Crypto Economics at Vienna University of Economics and founder of Blockchain Hub. She's also advisor to Jolicom, a blockchain-based identity protocol. In the past, she was a curator of the DEO on the advisory board of the Estonian e-residency and an advisor to Wonder, a decentralized art museum. She regularly speaks at conferences and consults on blockchains, especially in the context of sustainability and social impact of future technologies. Her past work experience ranges from internet startups, IT consulting, and filmmaking. She's an Austrian with Iranian roots and lives between Vienna and Berlin. Frank Schweitzer is full professor of systems design at ETH Zurich. He is also associated member of the Department of Physics at the ETH Zurich. He's worked for Max Planck Institute for the Physics of Complex Systems, Dresden, Fraunhofer Institute for Autonomous Intelligence Systems, and Humboldt University, Berlin, Cornell University, and Emory University. His research focuses on applications of complex systems theory in the dynamics of social and economic organizations. He is interested in the phenomena as diverse as user interaction in online social networks, collective decisions in animal groups, failure cascades and systemic risk in economic networks, and the rise and fall of collaborations in socio-technical systems. He's a founding member of ETH Risk Center and editor-in-chief of ACS Advances in Complex Systems. And our moderator, Margaret Childs, has worked as a journalist, editor, and producer for TV, print, and online media for employers including Condé Nast Traveler and the Associated Press, as well as writing about business and startup-related topics for Austrian daily Die Presse. In the fall of 2015, she founded the cross-media publishing company Hometown Media and launched its central product, Austria's leading English-language magazine, Metropole. Since the summer of 2017, she has been on the board of a nonprofit organization and think tank, Austrian Startups. Please welcome me in joining all of our panelists and members to the panel. The panel discussion is entitled Trust But Verify, and basically what we're saying is that it's a continuous battle to combat falsity, and new digital media platforms based on blockchain can run applications exactly as programmed without interference. But we don't know enough about the phenomenon of falsity and why it spreads so readily on digital media. We may be closer to understanding what interventions might be. The panel will discuss possible interventions to mitigate and hopefully prevent the spread of falsity, including how new digital media platforms will algorithmically redefine confirmation, validation, and value. How could blockchain and tokenization of social media provide a solution to these problems? What can we learn from early blockchain use cases like Steemit, basic attention token, and token-curated registers? Margaret, I will let you begin by asking the questions.
Thanks very much, Randall. Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here today, and thanks so much for making it here to this panel. It's a fascinating topic we're talking about. There are a lot of ways to approach it, first of all, different viewpoints on the problem itself, but also different attempts at solving the problem using different tools. We saw a little bit now in your presentation, Sinan, about the psychological aspect of the choices we make and what we share. Perhaps we could go a little bit into just how the three of you see the problem. First of all, where its source is, talking about the economic incentives that you mentioned and the psychological, but also how you've seen it in your research as well, Mr. Schweitzer, and also from the standpoint of your research. So please, maybe you'll sum it up just because
Sure.
we're moving from your talk.
Yeah, so briefly, it is an area of research that is really important going forward because that's where human beings interface with falsity, and it's not clear yet how we think about it. There are some working papers that haven't yet been published, for instance, that sort of indicate that it's a heuristic processing. So part of the reason falsity can spread and grow is because we're lazy, basically. We don't verify every piece of information that we share, and a lot of it has to do with essentially not being smart enough to discern, but not having the time in the current type of information environment that we're in to really verify every piece of information that we want to consume or share. There's also indications that there's polarization. In other words, there are different perspectives, where you come from, who you're connected to, what your political leanings are, will change the way you think about a particular topic, will make you more likely to mistrust and therefore verify information coming from one place, but not so much if it's coming from your own perspective and so on. We need a lot more research in this area.
So are we just lazy? Do we need more convenience when it comes to discerning the veracity of what we're reading?
So I think it's fascinating, the findings, and I'm still, like I heard your talk a few months ago, the data speaks for itself. However, I would like to maybe suggest that this might not necessarily only be a phenomenon of social media, but how we tend to consume media in general. We tend to react more to negative news, which is why even classic news providers who still have an editor who quality checks will tend to have more the sensational headlines in the foreground to sell more newspapers. I don't think this is necessarily a social media problem. However, since social media has the problem of provenance, we don't know where news comes from, and I think that's what we have two problems that are fundamental to social media, which are very different to traditional media, where we got rid of the editor, and we didn't replace it with anything else, and I think that is at the core of a lot of the problems, which are magnified, which we had before but are magnified now. And the thing is, we don't have provenance of where a piece of information comes from. And I think that some of the technologies that we have, AI and blockchain, could solve certain aspects of that.
We'll get to that in the second, solutions.
Yeah.
Let's think about the problem again a little bit first from maybe the AI perspective. Do you agree about the provenance?
I'm not representing the AI perspective, but let me just name 4 issues that I see basically underlying the fake news problem. The first one is the information overload, as you already said, so we have no time to basically check the facts. The second one is individualization. Before we had messages that were the same for everyone, and then we could decide collectively also whether this is right or wrong. Now it's much more personalized. That's the second problem. There's also the psychological issue that was nicely shown in your study, namely that we are curious creatures, so we are interested in deviations from the mean. So we want to see things that are not the main thing, right? So therefore, we pay more attention to those kind of information. And the fourth one, which I think should be discussed more, is fake news serve a purpose, right? So you mentioned nicely the economic purpose of earning money, which I think is one of the biggest drivers behind the scene as well. But it's also good for other people or the people in power that fake news exists, because if they are confronted with the truth, they can always say, well, that's fake news, right? So, okay, because we all know fake news exists, we can name the truth the fake news if we want so, right? So this is a very important argument for psychological reasons.
And maybe just to say, like, we're using the term fake news as if it were something new, and it isn't. We're just used to refer to it as propaganda.
Yeah.
And by giving an old phenomenon a new name, we're a bit confused because we're like, well, what are we supposed to do? But we know from history how and why propaganda comes from. The only difference here, and it's a fundamental difference, of course, is that it has, the tools of propaganda have become different, right? Because in this distributed world where anyone can contribute with content, where it's hard to verify where something came from, we have new attack vectors to attack the real information. Before, you needed to dominate the national broadcasting services, no? Until the 50s, before liberalization of television and radio, there was only one broadcaster. And you take over the one broadcaster, you dominate the news. And now the methods have become different. You need algorithmic manipulation, all that stuff. But the phenomenon is not new. And maybe it would help us stick to the old words, because we can build off years of study of where manipulation comes from, why it comes, and maybe we find some solutions there too. Some, not all, because it's a new phenomenon after all then.
So if we're thinking on the human level, on the human spectrum, what you mentioned before about having editors, and there being this entire step of the process that's being left out when it comes to the sharing on social media. Having worked in a bunch of news organizations, even where it has to go very fast, like in The Wire with the AP, yes, there were 3 editors that looked at everything before it went on.
And
so
it's hard. So how do we resolve in a distributed world where everyone can upload anything to Facebook, YouTube, all these things? We need distributed editing mechanisms, because otherwise we have a scalability problem. What Facebook, for example, or also YouTube, they're trying to do now, they have these human editors, and we met at CERN, and we both had a TEDx talk there, and there were some fascinating guys who were talking about, they shot a documentary about those people in the Philippines who are the Facebook editors. And you're trying to put, like, you have these war rooms where people are sitting and screening content, and within a split of a second, they have to decide whether they censor it or not. And it doesn't scale, because on the other side, anyone can upload, but then you have centralized systems to censor it. So I think the internet was revolutionary, allowing anyone to contribute to the web and to social media later on. But we don't have yet mechanisms in place that allow us to replace the role of an editor with a decentralized version of an editor, with reputation systems. Unfortunately, the web doesn't come with a native reputation layer. Why? Because identities can be pseudonymous on the web. And because of that, we cannot assign a reputation to someone, or it makes it really harder. And we'll get to this maybe later. Maybe with tokenization and reputation tokens, there could be a solution to that, but yeah. So having centralized solutions in a distributed network, I think that is the problem. And I don't envy Mark Zuckerberg, because he's in a very, very difficult situation. We don't have the tools yet,
yes.
you know. Yeah.
Well, what other, when we're just talking about kind of categories of ways of intervention, because from the one side saying, okay, there's this one step missing and we could probably find a technological solution to aid that step, what other kinds of intervention have you both touched on?
Let me start with a very general remark. We tend to forget that every type of intervention has 2 sides, an upside and a downside, right? So we tend to just talk about what we gain from regulating X and Y. No one talks about, or few people talk about, what can we lose at the same time. So I would prefer if the discussion about interventions addresses these 2 aspects. Right? If you think about fake news as a viral disease, so then it's very clear what kind of intervention should we do. We can develop a vaccine and then we vaccinate everyone, right? So that's the technical solution, right? So this would mean we create upload filters that detect to the 1% error level every fake news, right? Then we get rid of this. But there's a completely different way of intervention. This is namely to improve the resistance or the resilience of the individuals that are confronted with fake news. So we could also think of interventions that basically put media competence in the center. Then we have to talk about educating our young generation, for example, namely to learn how to detect fake news themselves and to learn not to trust every single piece that is attached to a picture and has a quotation. Right?
More the preemptive strategy.
There are two ways of handling this, and I think we have to basically follow both of these strategies. That's my message.
Sinan?
Well, I mean, I've had this conversation with a number of people on a number of panels, and every time I have this conversation on a panel, I become less and less convinced that we have good tools at our disposal, because there are a lot of different trade-offs that have to be made. And I really like the point about costs and benefits, because every time you intervene, there are going to be costs that are created. And I haven't heard a good intervention against fake news that is sort of a silver bullet. I think that this is always going to be an arms race. I mean, look, the most egregious example of the scale problem that we were just talking about is the recent New Zealand live streaming of a mass murder for 7 to 9 minutes after Facebook was informed that it was happening, and then the 300,000 additional uploads that weren't stopped, in the many minutes after that. This is not something that is easy to solve at all. When we take the editors out of the equation, I agree with you. So Harper's Magazine mentioned the term fake news first, and that was in the 1920s. So we have,
really?
yeah. Oh. So we have been talking about this for a long time, but I do think it's very different today. I think it's different today because the speed with which it spreads around the world and the decisions are taken before anybody could even know that it's happening is that speed is something that is very different than the broadcast media that we were talking about before. And what we've done is we've taken the editors out of the equation, but we've replaced it with a system that incentivizes engagement and attention, and that's the social media advertising ecosystem. And those algorithms that are curating that information are delivering information that generates attention, because that's what drives revenue. And if novelty is generating attention and false news is more novel, it's going to incentivize the spread of false news because it is exciting to people and people want to read it and want to share it. The solutions, things like content moderation, when you ban fake news, first you have to define what it is, but when you start taking information and what can be said in a public square off the table, you're suppressing speech. So on one hand, you're going to suppress fake news, but on the other hand, you're going to suppress speech, and as we know, sort of free speech is one of the essences of democracy. It's one of the things that keeps a democracy vibrant. So I agree. I think that these are very, very difficult trade-offs.
Double-edged sword. Mm-hmm. Yes, Sherman.
I do think, however, that newer technologies might bring solutions, right? We see, if we look at the history of the web, the web is evolving. The first generation of the internet was very simple. It was kind of read-only, right? And then as it progressed, we moved into what we call the Web 2, with all the platforms, one of them being social media, but also the e-commerce platform. And they had a lot of advantages, brought us a lot of advantages, but they were highly centralized, and we lack, for example, in social media, as we said, the role of an editor, because there is the scaling thing. And I think if we look at what blockchain technology as a driving force of this next generation internet could introduce certain solutions. One of them being what you mentioned earlier. I don't think there is a unique source of truth, but what blockchain can bring us is provenance of where did data come from. And can I trust it because it came from a trust? And whether it's trustworthy is still my decision. But what blockchain can bring us is transparency of the data trail and where it came from. And this would resolve a lot of issues on the consumer side, because I still have to decide for myself what I trust and who I trust, but at least I have much more transparency, which doesn't get rid of the cognitive bias that we have, that if I'm leftist, I might not trust Fox, etc., right? But at least we have much more transparency, because there are a lot of gray shades also. Another thing that blockchain technology can bring us with tokens, and for me, tokens are the killer application somehow of blockchains and smart contracts. And we already see, even though it might not have arrived in the mass, not everyone is using tokens today. We do have 2,200 tokens that are publicly traded. We have 150,000 token contracts that were created on one blockchain alone, on the Ethereum mainnet.
Can you describe tokens?
So, and a token can represent anything from an asset, a digital or a physical asset like gold, or like a digital asset like music, but it could also represent an access right. A token could facilitate an entry ticket to a concert, or me opening a door. A token can also incentivize, be programmed. It's basically a smart contract that runs on a blockchain, a digital rights management tool. It can also be programmed to incentivize contributions to a social network. So one of the interesting applications we're seeing out there now and is, for example, Steemit. Steemit is a social media application that runs on its proper blockchain. So data is not centrally managed. It's managed by a distributed ledger. So nobody owns that data. Everybody can run big data. And the application, the decentralized application called Steemit, is very similar to Facebook or Reddit. Anyone can upload content. It could be text, it could be a picture, and anyone can like that content. And when somebody uploads content and somebody else likes it, both get rewarded with Steem tokens. So, and these Steem tokens have value based on market demand and supply. And this social media platform has existed for 3 years. It has 1 million registered users. I personally know a few people who are long-term contributors, and for a period of time they could pay their rent with the money they were making through the tokens on Facebook. Now, I would, not on Facebook, on Steemit. I would like to mention, big disclaimer, Steemit is a very interesting use case. However, the tokens on Steemit have fundamental design flaws. There is not only one token, there are 3 tokens, one of them being a reputation token. Unfortunately, that reputation token is designed in a way that you can buy reputation with money, which is a fundamental design flaw. However, it shows us that you have a very different type of social network when people can now earn money with contributions. That's one use case. Another use case is the basic attention token. Very different thing, but it is related to big data. Nowadays, we are, as users of many platforms, we don't have any control over what happens with our data. We often don't pay for the services, but our data is used for advertising reasons, right? And then things happen like the thing in Macedonia, right? Basic attention token is a very novel concept that reverses the role of the marketer and the marketeer, where I now get paid with attention tokens, or first of all, those who watch the ads can be rewarded directly for watching the ads, or they can pay for not watching the ads. And because it's blockchain-based, the data is never passed on to third parties. I have, all the data is tied to a data rail token.
Let me stop you and ask you two questions, because I'm fascinated by this. One is, why doesn't the reputation system that you just described simply devolve into a popularity contest? Where is there any real veracity there? And second, does the attention token concept lead to a devolution of the value of advertising, where low-value consumers are the ones who are willing to get paid for attention, and high-value consumers are squeezed out of the market?
Okay, very good questions. I think nobody can tell at this point. You have to consider that tokens are what HTML was in the 90s, right? We had the internet all along, but when did the internet become a big thing? When Berners-Lee came and created the standard for easily creating visual websites, and now everyone not knowing how to use a computer could easily navigate the web, right? And it was with a few lines of code. If you, those who knew HTML, and it's a fairly simple programming language, anyone could create a website. But in the beginning, it was really nobody knew what to put on these websites, right? It took us 10 years until the web became a big thing, and then this is what we called the Web 2, because this is when people actually understood what they can do with websites. We're at a very, very similar stage when it comes to tokens. I could, on this computer now, create a token contract, a smart contract on the blockchain representing a token with a few lines of code in a few minutes. But the governance rules of what this token does, it's not a technological question, it's a question of business logic, it's a governance question. And to develop this, we need a lot of brain power that goes into this. Why does Steemit not have a better reputation token? Because they started quite early, it's like 4 years old. And there are alternative social media networks on blockchain that are learning from the Steemit flaws, and they're trying to do this better. So I think we will enter a few years of trial and error until we can figure out better reputation systems. And with the attention token, it's still in a prototype phase, so I think we will need a few years to figure out what it would mean for an advertising market. So I don't say that we have all the answers today, but I do say that we have this very fascinating technology that could be a tool to create it better, but we have to contribute to it. And I think the findings from your experience would be very important when engineering a reputation token, right? So this is not, and what we find is like, for example, the people behind Steemit. Unfortunately, the guy creating it, he was a trader. So somebody who believes in the Austrian School of Economics and the Homo economicus, modeling the reputation token based on proof of stake, like those who have more stake in the network are likely to contribute better to the network. I don't share this vision. That was his vision. He put it into the code, but we're seeing now that it's not working. Anyone could create their own better version of Steemit any day now.
We kind of have two tiers here now. We have the reputation-based version, the Steemit idea, but also that which ties in with the advertising, which of course is part of the monetary incentive for the fake news in the first place. So perhaps, but it's basically taking the media out of the equation in the sense of the user or the viewer or the reader decides whether it wants to pay for or be paid for its attention being used by an advertiser. I think that how that's used with the media may be kind of a around the corner solution, if I've understood it correctly.
We don't know yet. The technology is so super raw
Yeah.
and so super new, and we don't have the network effects yet.
Mm-hmm.
I think it will take another 5 years, honestly, until solutions like Steemit will become mainstream, solutions like basic attention token will become more mainstream, and only then will we see what that really means. But that will fundamentally change the discussions that we have now, and this is why I wanted to say that.
But rolling back to the kind of how things can be regulated or looked at or controlled to a certain extent, now we saw it from a decentralized way. Think of it more from a governmental standpoint or a company standpoint, private sector or public sector. Should the companies be regulating? Should Facebook be regulating what goes on there? I mean, we now in Europe have just passed Article 13. I don't know how you guys feel about this. There were a lot of protests in Vienna against this article or this directive. It's not yet been put into force in each of the countries, but it definitely creates a new hurdle to overcome when uploading content, and a lot are saying this is taking away the freedom of expression on the internet and making it difficult for user-generated content to be produced at the scale it's been produced until now. Is that a good thing? Sinan, maybe?
I think that these are incredibly hard questions. So in the United States, there's a couple of debates going on. One is break up Facebook, break up the monopolies, okay? And another one is regulate the content, exactly as you're describing. So right now, the Communications Decency Act in the United States establishes Facebook and these other platforms as pass-through organizations. They're not responsible for the content that other people post to their platforms, except in very narrow, limited circumstances like a sex trafficking bill, which was unanimously passed in the Congress, that says you aren't responsible for any content on your platform unless it's an ad for sex trafficking, in which case you are. But you could imagine doing that for every instance of a harmful piece of content and regulate, bill by bill by bill. But now what you're doing is you're essentially trading off free speech and the value of user-generated content with the mitigation of harm against fake news and so on.
The double-edged sword you were speaking of
Yeah.
earlier.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, I think that this notion of antitrust as a solution to fake news is kind of crazy. I mean, just having a bunch of smaller Facebooks isn't going to solve the fake news crisis. Antitrust is a tool that's useful for two things: maintaining consumer welfare and maintaining innovation. And those are really those are the nails that hammer is built for, not privacy and not fake news. You also have privacy regulation. You have GDPR here. Now there's going to be privacy regulation in the United States. It's not clear what it's going to look like. My concern is that the lawmakers are not informed. The lawmakers who will be writing and passing these laws have very little clue what they are doing. Because I had my big bowl of popcorn.
Those viral videos that went around.
Well, no, I mean, I had my big bowl of popcorn when Mark Zuckerberg went to testify in front of Congress in the United States. I was like, I stayed home from work and I was, watching him testify. And I was appalled at the questioning. It was just sort of so basic and so uninformed that to think that those people are then going to write the laws that are going to regulate a massive part of the economy and society, it's very troubling. I think they need to seek expert opinion.
There have been many insights like that about European Parliament on this decision as well.
Yes. Let me take the perspective of the professor of systems design here, right? So, I mean, we're talking about a complex system, as we call it here. So, and there are two ways to regulate this. One way is top-down. That's the way of setting legal constraints. And I think that this is unavoidable. But with every regulation, we should think about the two sides, the pros and the cons. So therefore, we cannot take regulative effort to the lowest level of basically controlling our communication. So therefore, there is a second way of influencing system, namely the bottom-up way, where I focus on the interaction of individuals and then try via mechanism design to influence the way people interact, right? So why, if I see a news coming in that turns out to be a fake news, why am I not able to put a score on the communication path on which I got this kind of news, and then we assign a trust value to certain communication paths. This works on the individual level. For every individual, it will be different, but it can be quantified, for example. That's a different way. It's a bottom-up way to basically generate additional information that other people can use for their informed decision.
Could we imagine this to be like a TripAdvisor or Amazon rating for news? As in, this is the user is making this rating,
yes,
or the reader.
So the difference is, so in the trust matrix that we have developed, the key point is that I assign a trust value to the communication path. So that means how I got to this communication via you, via Sinan, and then I can weight this, and then this propagates back in the chain, and then we can identify, okay, if it comes along this path, it's probably a fake news. But if it comes along another path, probably not, right? That's the idea.
Digging into that for a minute, is that going to be a single rating for that path for everyone, or does everyone
No,
have a personalized
yeah,
rating?
it's a personalized trust matrix.
Is that likely to create these filter bubbles that Eli Pariser talked about, where as Pew has surveyed, the Republicans are going to trust the paths that they trust, and then in the U.S., the Democrats are going to definitely not trust those paths, and suddenly we're going to live in two different information bubbles?
Good point, but it will not, right? Because we are talking about different kind of information. I see this as different layers, right? If it comes from you and we are talking about sciences, then I will trust this. If it comes from you and we have a very different subject, I will probably not trust it. So that means that we basically have more flexibility in defining.
I mean, like what I'm saying is that some people out there would put their highest trust rating on Breitbart and Alex Jones, InfoWars, right? And other people would say that's their lowest trust rating.
Yes.
And if you give people personalized trust rating, then they will continue to get their what other people think is false news, and then the other side will continue to get what the other side thinks is false news, creating sort of like separating equilibria.
That's
right?
where we are already, isn't
That's
it?
where we are now. Yeah.
But we always had that in society. Filter bubbles also is not a new thing, right? Only that, of course, in the internet, it might, when we have no control over the algorithms, I think that's when it becomes a problem. But like we live in, like up until the 90s, we lived in analog filter bubbles, like based on where you went to school, the university you were at, you knew certain people, the studies, the background of your family. You had filter bubbles of people you spent your time with, and they had certain opinions, and you were copy-pasting their opinions. And so we saw that, and people would break out of their personalized filter bubbles if they maybe studied abroad, etc. And then they had these experiences where they're like, okay, wow, that's a very different perspective on life.
Before we get too deep into filter bubbles, let me just, because we don't have much time left, and I'm sorry, it's so fascinating, we could talk about this for another hour. But before we get too deep into filter bubbles, I think we all agree that those are nothing new either. It's definitely a different medium now that we're seeing these bubbles in. But let's get back to the idea of free speech and democracy, and also, the question is false news or is fake news good for democracy? Is it good that we're seeing other? We're having to question these sources in a new way, and basically forcing us to ask ourselves whether we believe something or not, and making us less easy to manipulate than if we weren't aware of the veracity problem.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Well, then we're done.
No.
I mean,
It's not. I mean, it's a longer process. Right?
Yeah, but we do need to acknowledge that in a democracy, people have different opinions, and they might, in my opinion, be fake. But I think it's very, very, there is a danger of one single truth.
Yes.
We need a tolerance towards multiple truths.
I don't remember who said it, but there's a good quote that says, you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. Yeah. That there's different levels of information where we should all be able to agree on a certain reality and then develop differing opinions on top of that. Now, that's also murky because, again, it goes to the provenance and the source and who's credible and not, and I might have a different opinion on credibility. And when there's diversity of opinion on credibility, then even facts become question marks. So,
well, if we have this in the newsroom and in all the media organizations I've ever worked in, is always the question of, are we doing an opinion piece, are we doing a fact-based piece, or is it a news piece or opinion piece? And also, I have 3 things I don't allow my writers to do. Unsubstantiated claims. Nobody can ever say anything without backing it up. Even the sky is blue, by observing it, I could tell the sky is blue, right? Fine. But there's always have a source for the information that you're claiming, right? I think this touches more on the editor, the lack of an editor in these spectrums. But if we're talking about just the double-edged sword side of it, are we by trying to regulate the spreading of fake news, are we also taking away people's voice, whether it's fake or not, their right to an opinion, so to say, even if they're framing it as fact?
Exactly. I think that's a really good point to maybe start differentiating between facts and opinions. right? And we need this public discourse, and I think we're finally having it. I mean, please don't forget, like, how old is social media? It's like, what, 10, 15 years old? That's really nothing. So obviously, in the first years of social media, only parts of society were consuming it. I don't even know who remembers, what was before Facebook? I forgot it. MySpace. I mean, who used MySpace? It was super edgy, right? But then social media really became a mass phenomenon through Facebook, even though we had it before, right? And as it became a mass phenomenon, as it became a potential also tool to politicize information, we are now, for the last 2, 3 years or 4 years, seeing that on a mass level, I mean, people like Evgeny Morozov have been talking about this ever since the internet emerged, but nobody cared, right? So he was saying things like that already, but now that it is a mass phenomenon based on experience, now we're having a public discourse, which I'm happy that we're having, because this will provide for the creation of a discourse, but also tools so we can have more sophisticated way to deal with this phenomenon. It's very similar to, do you remember the mobile phones? The first mobile phones in the 90s, so apart from the fact that they were very big, the people who had them, they were running around, and then every time the phone rang, they thought it was loud, so they never muted it. They were picking up it instantly like it's a landline. And it took people, I think, roughly 10 years to understand that, okay, it's a mobile phone, it's personal. A, I see who called. B, I can mute it. They can still send me a text message. I don't always have to answer immediately because it's not a landline. Yeah. So I think what we're going through now, thanks to researchers like you, is like we're learning more about the inner mechanisms of how these systems can be gamed. And now we're being more educated, and I do see also the threats of these, video manipulations, but I do trust people. I'm not as negative in my outlook.
Well, just on that question of trust, I think maybe we can take 2 or 3 of these questions from the audience. One of them up there is, what's the concept of truth? Well, I study philosophy. They could take hours. But is truth what cannot be what is not falsified? Falsified is probably a difficult word there. Perhaps this means proven false. Is that correct, Mr. Jodelbauer? Yeah. Yes. Okay. So is this kind of the scientific way of proving truth, or how would we approach that scene, especially in your?
It depends on who you ask. So if you asked Richard Feynman this question, he would say no theory could ever be proven true. Yeah. It can only ever be proven false. You could have evidence that corroborates a theory, but it's always going to be essentially either falsified or still standing, but not necessarily proven true, because somebody could find something in the future that proves that it's false. So I think this is a very difficult question. Obviously, we're not just talking about scientific theories here. I think that what you can't escape in this question is who gets to decide. Yeah. I think that's a fundamental question. Is it the platforms? Is it the government? Is it personalized for every person gets their own opinion about what's true or what's false? Are there different layers of information, some of which can be labeled as true and false, like facts versus opinions? I don't have an answer for you, but I think that this is the discourse we need to be having.
The other question that a bunch of people wanted to hear answered was the Austrian broadcasting service, ORF, has decided to withdraw from Facebook on April 1st, and it was only actually active on Facebook for 17 months. So will that be one tipping point away from unethical social media? I think it's a very interesting question. I'm not sure if ORF controls whether the rest of the world is unethical and unedited, but
well, just to highlight one thing, 2 words that have been said on this panel. One, you mentioned network effects, and here they're talking about tip. Okay, so network effects are a huge part of this story. So a network effect is when the value of a product or a platform is a function of the number of users who use it. So Facebook is very powerful because it has 2.2 billion users, and that creates a lot of network effects. The thing about networked industries and products is that they're tippy. Okay, and what that means is that if it starts going in the other direction, they can tip in a different direction. Okay, and that's why what Facebook is facing right now is an existential crisis. Because if the delete Facebook movement gains traction, and if there is a viable alternative, it actually faces a tipping. And for those of you who look at Facebook and say 2.2 billion users, come on, it could never happen, go talk to the founders of MySpace, who were the Facebook of Facebook before Facebook was Facebook. Now, if there's a new one around the corner, and if Facebook faces and doesn't really deal with this existential crisis well, it could face a mass exodus in the same way that it faced a mass flocking to because of network effects. So I think network effects is a tricky subject that's really important here.
But I think there's one thing to add to the discussion about ORF. I mean, we are invited and encouraged to diversify the sources how we communicate, right? I mean, ORF is not bound to just communicate on Facebook. ORF has certainly other means to reach the customers, and if we have an interest to communicate with ORF, probably should use these additional means, right? So we are not the slaves of a given platform, even if some people feel like this, right? So diversity is a solution, right?
I maybe my last word on this would like to be that diversity is a very important word that you use, because I think fake news is really a big problem. But when we look for solutions, we should be very careful not to kill diversity, because then we're in a very weird space. That there is only one source of truth, and there is who decides, and it's a biblical discussion that we will then have, a religious discussion of what's true and what's false, and who's allowed to decide. I think people have the potential to be more differentiated and yeah.
I think we already have the diversified opinion space. That's not the point. The point is, will people talk to each other across the borders, right? And this is my comment on the discussion of the filter bubble, right? So, of course, these filter bubbles are immediately generated, but they become bubble if they get very hard walls, if we never talk to each other. So what we need to ensure basically is that despite the fact that we are diverse and basically have our own set of truths, we are still able to communicate to the rest of the world. And that's the thing that worries me the most at the moment.
So we need an exchange program for filter bubbles.
Well, it's funny you say that, because if you go back to the current algorithmic editors, you have a machine learning algorithm that rates and ranks what goes into your newsfeed on Facebook. It's based on relevance and so on. And it's evolved over time, and it's opaque. We don't exactly know how it works. But one of the driving forces is engagement. So the more you engage with a certain type of content, the more you're going to get that content. Why? Because that's how they get paid, right? The more attention they can drive to content, the more money they can make from advertising dollars. But what if that algorithm also included diversity? In other words, what if that algorithm favored diversity and gave you more diverse content? Now, it does do that to some extent, because if there's a space of all content and it just keeps feeding you the stuff that it knows you like, it might miss something that you like because it hasn't shown it to you before. So it wants to randomly sample the content at some point just to see the space and see how you react to different parts of the space. But what I'm talking about is, what if it actually weighted or valued diversity in addition to maximizing engagement itself? What if it actually reduced engagement in order to increase diversity? So these are design choices that are being made at Facebook, but that are being informed by the public conversation that Facebook faces. The fact that there is a delete Facebook movement, and the voices that are shared in that movement saying, why am I deleting Facebook? I'm deleting Facebook because it's a filter bubble, or I'm deleting Facebook because it's fake news. The more those voices are expressed, hopefully, the more the engineers that design the current algorithmic editors and curators will take that into their objective function for how to design the algorithms that curate the flow of information in society, not just based on maximizing advertising revenue. Because they face an existential crisis in an exodus from Facebook, they may be forced to include things that are not revenue maximizing in the short run on advertising, but are revenue maximizing in the long run because it keeps users there. If users are expressing themselves about, I don't want any more fake news, I don't want to be in a filter bubble, and so on, then Facebook has to deliver on that, even if it reduces short-term advertising dollars, because everyone would just leave the platform in a tippy market with network effects.
I'm afraid we're out of time, but yes, we've talked about a couple of solutions here, a solution attempts at least. I think we all can agree that we all have our different bubbles that we're in the real world as well. We've chosen this one to be together in today, which is wonderful, and I'd just like to thank the panel. Yes, please give them a round of applause. Thank you very much.